Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent. And today we're going to be looking at all the new cards that just released today for the new Harvest of Sorrow expansion, the last component of the Price of Power set. I'll give you my thoughts on every new card so you don't have to search the 7 Seas of Skellige just to find them all and see which cards are best. I'll talk about which decks and situations might be a good fit for the cards, and because I usually play seasonal events, I'll analyze cards from both a standard and seasonal event perspective. If you're excited about the new Price of Power kegs, then tune in later today at twitch.tv/lidsvids at 10 p.m. GMT to watch me open over 1,000 kegs. Think of it as our celebration. So let's start with Scoia'tael, and we'll begin with the epic card Torque. Whenever he gets boosted in your hand, he will also boost a random unit in your hand by the same amount. And if you have Devotion, then it'll always start in your hand. And I want to start with this one because hand boosting is definitely the theme for Scoia'tael in this expansion, and Torque is going to be a great way to enable that. So if you have Hawker Smugglers or Dunga on the board, or ideally even play Ithilien to target Torque specifically, then Torque is potentially going to double the amount of boost that you get, making other cards that benefit from hand boosting that much better. So that could mean some more Glace appearances, or some of the other new cards. Alright, so that was the hand boosting enabler, but now we have additional targets for hand boosting, starting with Filavandrel, and he will create and play a Scoia'tael special card based on how much power he has. This means that the more you hand boost him, the more powerful that special card might be. And notably, there is no cap on this and is not restricted to bronze cards. So that means if you get some really big hand boosts on him, then you could get something huge, like Shaping Nature. And the difference between playing him in the melee versus the range row is that you play him in the melee row if he has exactly the amount of power to match exactly the provision cost of the specific card that you want to play. Otherwise, if you're not exactly sure what you want to play, you put him in the range row and you'll have a few options. Then we have the rare special card, Bountiful Harvest, which is another hand boosting enabler because it will give you 3 different options for Dolbothana Elf units to play. If you choose the left option, you'll boost the leftmost card in your hand. If you choose the right option, you'll boost the rightmost card in your hand. And if you choose the middle option, then you'll boost a random card in your hand. So if one of the cards that you want to get hand boosted happens to be in the leftmost position or in the rightmost position, then this is a way to guarantee that you can boost that card. Whereas if it's somewhere else in your hand, or if you have several cards that could benefit from hand boosting and you don't care which one gets the boost, then you could choose the middle option. And then you're also going to be weighing that against the value of whichever Dolbothana Elf happens to fit best for the situation in which you're looking to play it. So this will definitely help with more of the cards that you want to get hand boosted, and some of those Dolbothana Elves are quite powerful, such as the Sentry for movement, or the Sorceress if you're going all-out special cards. So this gives you lots of options. Then lastly, we have Watcher of the Valley, the common unit from this expansion, and when you play this card, it will give bleeding to an enemy unit equal to the amount of boost that this card has. And what that means is that you're going to need to boost this in your hand to increase the amount of bleeding that you apply. Then if you happen to already have one on the playing field, rather than applying bleed, you'll apply direct damage. This is another potential target for hand boosting, but not so surprisingly for a 4 provision cost unit. I don't think it's a very good one. So for the most part, I think this is probably a backup plan that you'll throw into your deck without ever planning to play it, but if you're doing all your hand boosting and this happens to get a lot of the boosts, then maybe you do consider playing it. Otherwise, you'll probably mulligan it back into your deck in between rounds. So in other words, it's a 4 provision cost hand boosting safety net. Alright, now let's talk about Nilfgaard. First, we have Lydia van Bredevoort, who will create and play a bronze special card from your opponent's faction if you play her in the melee row, or will play a bronze special card specifically from your opponent's graveyard if you play her in the range row. Basically, this is another way of triggering Assimilate, much like Imperial Diplomacy, just in this case it comes with a 5 power body. But I don't think this is going to be the biggest card for Nilfgaard from this expansion. Next, we have the Illusionist, who will spawn a base copy of a bronze unit from your opponent's graveyard to the right of the card, and set its power to 1, or if you already have an Illusionist out there, then it will still spawn that base copy of the bronze unit from your opponent's graveyard, but it will not set its power down to 1. And here we start to get a better sense as to what the theme is for Nilfgaard with this expansion, and the answer is manipulating your opponent's graveyard. But in this case, it's kind of risky, because you'd love to be able to spawn a 1 power unit that is an engine, so that it generates more points over time. But even if you do, it'll be easy for your opponent to destroy it. But if not, then you get the 3-point body from the Illusionist, the 1-point body from the card that you're spawning, and then you're just getting 4 power for 4 provisions, and that's not very inspiring. I suppose the bonded ability makes it relatively safe that you're going to get more than 4 points, but I just don't think this card is going to be consistent enough to be worth that much commitment. At least, maybe not until round 3 when your opponent has more units in their graveyard. Then we get to Imperial Practitioner, and this one is humongous, possibly the best card for Nilfgaard in this expansion, despite it being just the rare card. First of all, it's a 5 power unit that has Assimilate, so it's an engine, but it also has an extremely powerful order ability, spawning a base copy of the last card that went to your opponent's graveyard onto the top of your deck. And as a heads up, if you played at the start of the second or third round, then that will be the unit that your opponent had on the right side of the range row, and if they didn't have anything in the range row, then the card that they had on the right side of the melee row. So if you use that order without any planning or setup, then you may not get a very good card for this. However, if, for example, you played Vilgefortz on your previous turn and moved your opponent's best unit to their graveyard, then suddenly you can get a copy of that card with the Imperial Practitioner at the top of your deck. And because this is a bronze unit, you could play another Imperial Practitioner on your next turn to get another copy of that powerful unit at the top of your deck. And then with a combination of Hoakim, Kudgra, War Council, and or Oniromancy, you could get all those cards out. So when you think about how powerful that combo can be, I honestly think you could almost double the provision cost of this card, and it would still be good, because that is just insane. Then lastly, we have Vilgefortz Renegade, which is similar to the card we were just looking at, except instead of putting a card from our opponent's graveyard into our deck, we swap that card from their graveyard with a card in our hand. So that does provide some additional value, because then we could play that card immediately on our next turn without any additional setup, and it also allows us to thin out one of our weakest cards. However, Vilgefortz Renegade does not have Assimilate, so he's not an engine, so although he's easier to use and set up than the Imperial Practitioner, you could make the case that at the high end, he is not going to be worth as many points. Alright, and next we have Syndicate, and let me just acknowledge that I definitely do not play much Syndicate, so I don't have as much experience to contextualize how good these cards will be in comparison to Syndicate cards that we already have. And the Savvy Huckster is the common unit, and on deploy between the profit and the damage, is basically a 6 for 4, which is not great, but if you already have one out there and trigger the bonded ability, then he becomes functionally an 8 for 4, and that's pretty good. I don't know if that's good enough to justify putting him in Syndicate decks, but interestingly, this could work in any of a number of Syndicate archetypes. Next, we have the rare special card Purge, which is a crime that deals 3 damage to an enemy unit, which is low, especially for a 5 provision cost card, but the damage goes up by 1 for every Witch Hunter you have on the board. So I think you definitely like to play this later in the round when you have those Witch Hunters out on the board and get more damage, but you might not want to play it on your last turn in a round, because if you do take out a unit with it, you'll place a bounty on the highest power enemy unit, so just make sure that you also give yourself enough time to get rid of the card that you just put the bounty on. This also jumps out at me as a great card to use for the dual casting seasonal events, where the first special card that you play on your turn, you play twice, because if you do have those Witch Hunters out there, you can get a ton of damage and a ton of bounties. Next we have the Brute, which is a legendary unit that has both a profit and a boost ability. Profit will go up by 1 for every bounty that you've played in a match, meaning that the later you play this, the stronger it will be, and the boost will be the value of whatever unit you most recently destroyed that had a bounty on it. So that means you'd also like to play the Brute just after destroying a big bountied unit. So not so surprisingly, bounty has definitely been the theme for Syndicate in this expansion, and that continues here with the Brute. So the more bounties and the more damage you have in your deck, the more effective this card will be. And in terms of the specific cards to pair with it, I think the Scoundrel might be one of the best options. Lastly, we have Octavia Hale, who has 7 power and 7 provisions, and when you play her, draws 2 of Octavia's sons into your hand, then shuffles the same number of cards that you drew back into your deck. So basically, this is a thinning / tutor card, serving a similar purpose as, say, Selective Mutation, just rather than spawning in Little Witcher students, you get a bigger 7 power body, and in this case, the cards that you're getting in your hand are going to be either the Brute that we were just talking about, Ignatius Hale, one of the previous cards that we got for Price of Power, or I believe the Scoundrel is also one of her sons, though I'm not 100% certain about that. Of course, all those cards were bounty-based cards, so again, you're likely to put Octavia in a Witch Hunter bounty-themed deck, and she'll help make that deck more consistent by putting the cards that you want in your hand. And since those are some really nice cards that you get in your hand, I think Octavia could be a solid addition for those specific types of Syndicate decks, though people may not appreciate her as much because she isn't putting up as many points directly. And next we have Skellige, starting with Little Halfru, which is a common unit. It has 6 power for 4 provisions, which is okay, but if you already have one on the board, then when you play the second one, it'll play as 8 power for 4. which is basically the same as many of the other common units that we've seen in this expansion. However, her order ability is interesting. It damages the card by 4, and then spawns Rain on an enemy row for 2 turns. Now, Rain damages 2 random enemy units by 1, so 2 turns of Rain means 4 damage, so if you damage yourself by 4 and deal 4 damage, then the order ability is hurting you just as much as it hurts your opponent. However, this is Skellige we're talking about, so there are some interesting ways to benefit from both dealing that damage and taking that damage. If you have cards that get boosted or healed whenever you deal damage, like say an on-crate Greatsword or Dagger 2 Blades, then that would give you additional value. Or if you have a way of healing Little Halfru with something like a Heimei Flaminiko or Restore, then you can also benefit from the self-damage. So while this card may not be amazing, I like how it has a lot of versatility, because there are so many other cards that you could combine with it to make it more effective. Next we have Messenger of the Sea, a 4 power, 6 provision cost rare unit, and whenever Rain or Storm damages an opponent, the Messenger will get boosted by the same amount of damage that you dealt. And this reminds me of one of my favorite Skellige cards, which is one of the ones that I just mentioned. To me, this looks a lot like a Dagger 2 Blades that, rather than getting boosted every time you deal damage, has a more specific set of circumstances to set it up, although with all the new sources of Rain and Storm, that shouldn't be too hard to do, and in return, you save 4 provisions, which seems like a pretty good bargain to me, especially since this is a bronze card, which means you can put 2 of them in your deck, and if you combine that with something like a Megascope, then you can get even more. And another small benefit that this has over Dagger is that it is not row-locked to the melee row, so it's a little bit harder for your opponent to counter it. Obviously, in this case, you're putting it in any deck that can cause a bunch of Rain or Storm, so it makes a lot of sense to combine it with Fulmar and Melusine. Then we have even more Rain and Storm synergies with Ryogan the Undying, and especially as of late, we've seen some cards that start in our hand. However, Ryogan will actually start in our graveyard, but if we find a way to summon or play him out of our graveyard with, say, something like Sigdrifa's Right, then we will trigger all remaining Rain and Storm on our opponent's side of the board. Now, this could be a fantastic finisher if you still have a ton of turns of Rain or Storm and the round is about to end. So I think the best way to use Ryogan is probably to load up on that Rain and Storm, then play Bride of the Sea near or at the end of the round to get Sigdrifa's Right and summon Ryogan from your graveyard and trigger all of the remaining Rain and Storm. And if you already have Dagger or Messenger of the Sea on the board, then you will get a ton of points from doing this. And this will probably be even stronger in seasonal events such as dual casting, double down, or +1, where you may be able to get even more Rain and even more Storm on your opponent's side of the board. Then lastly, we have the 5 power, 13 provision cost legendary unit Fukusia. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but this card is insane, because when you play it, you get to play a Skellige unit from your graveyard that costs 10 provisions or less, and give it doomed. Now this is really similar to Renew, which is a 12 provision special card that can play a 9 provision cost or less card from your graveyard and give it doomed, so it's slightly stronger than that, though it does specifically need to be a Skellige card. You also get the 5 power body from Fukusia, so as long as you're looking to bring back Skellige units, it should definitely be stronger than Renew. And if you happen to bring back a unit that costs less than 10 provisions, then you'll spawn Rain on the opposite row with a duration equal to the number of unused provisions. So for example, that means if you brought back a 7 provision unit, you'd spawn Rain on your opponent's side for 3 turns. So in case you happen to want to bring back a smaller unit, you're still going to get solid value. Now, I think this is ridiculously powerful because Renew is already a good card, and we're saying this is better than Renew, especially because if we're increasing that provision limit from 9 to 10, that means we can now choose Olaf, which you could do in some self-damaging decks, Ernachad, which could be very strong to play him twice, especially if you play Siana first, to play Fukusia's deployability twice, in which case you could bring back Ernachad as well as Sucris, or Covenant of Steel, to have a really strong Ernachad combo in 2 separate rounds. Rock on Crate would be another option for damaging pirate decks. Melusine would be amazing, because she also works in rain decks, and she has Veil, so she's not even going to get doomed, in which case this would let you play her a second time, but you might even be able to find a way to get her out a third time. Draco Turtle, not a bad option for self-damage. Mork Varg, which could be a fantastic option if your opponent is getting greedy with boosts. Tiergate for a little bit safer damage. Gambi for memes. Dogger to get boosted from all your damage. Pro Mother probably wouldn't be a target because you can already get her out of your graveyard. And lastly, Hjalmar, which could maybe be a way to deal more damage. Though since you banished the unit that you used the first time, you'd have to have a good second target to use in this case, which may not be that realistic. But considering all those options at 10 provisions, and considering that you could still go below 10 provisions and get some additional rain on the board, this might be my favorite card from this expansion. Next up, we have monsters, starting with the 5 power, 4 provision common unit, Lesser Witch, who will spawn a base copy of itself in your graveyard, or if you already have one on the board, will instead spawn that copy on the playing field. Most of the previous 4 provision common cards that we've looked at from this expansion have been 6 power for 4 provisions and then 8 power for 4 provisions with Bonded. However, in this case, it starts as 5 for 4, but with Bonded goes up to 10 for 4. So in other words, without Bonded, it's worse than the other common units, but with Bonded, it's better. However, it is worth noting that it is a relic, and with all the recent relic synergies for monsters, that could be reason enough to include it in some relic decks. Next, we have the Incubus, which is a rare 5 for 5 unit, and this reminds me a bit of Nilfgaard's new Illusionist card, because when you play the Incubus, you'll summon a bronze unit from your opponent's graveyard to their side of the board, and then summon a bronze unit of equal or less provisions from your graveyard to your side of the board. So in this case, it's monsters doing the graveyard manipulation, and it looks like you're basically making the bet that your bronze units are better than your opponent's bronze units. And with all the new cards like the Self-Eaters and the Witch's Apprentices, that may be a relatively safe bet to make. And again, this is another relic, so it does synergize with cards like the Self-Eater. Next we have the 10 provision cost epic special card Witch's Sabbath. It's an organic card, so you could play it with Wispa's Tribute, and it summons 3 of your opponent's highest power units from their graveyard to their side of the board, then summons the same number of highest power units from your graveyard to your side of the board. Notably, you can only summon monster units. I think this is a really fun card, because I think there are several use cases for this. The most simple is, if you happen to have played more powerful units than your opponent, then you'll be getting out stronger units than your opponent, and because Monsters does have some high base power units, and nowadays even has ways to increase their base power, that could be a viable option. Another way to use this could be if your opponent's strongest units are not engines, but yours are, so that way long term, your units will generate more value, whereas your opponent's will not. I imagine that's probably going to be both the most effective and the most common way that people will use it. Then lastly, and the most niche way you could use this, would be if your opponent has some units that are row locked, and either you don't, or the row that you want is not the same row that your opponent wants. Because bear in mind, you get to choose what row your opponent's units end up on, and then your units will spawn on the opposite row. So for example, if your opponent has some strong units that are locked to the range row, and you have some strong units that are locked to the melee row, you could summon your opponent's units to the melee row where they can't use them, and then your units would end up in your melee row where you can use them. So I think that's unlikely to happen, but if you're feeling clever, there might be a few times when that's a decent play to make. Then lastly, we have Yaga, a 1 power, 13 provision legendary unit. It's another relic card, so more relic synergies, and it's like a combination of a Toad Prince and a Slizzard, because its order ability is to consume a 4 provision unit. Importantly, that does not say your unit, which means you could consume one of your opponent's 4 provision cost units. Then once you've done that, after 2 turns, you can consume a 5 provision cost unit. And every 2 turns after that, the provision cost limit goes up by 1. So this definitely has some amazing meme potential. But at 13 provisions, it might be a tough fit in some decks, especially if your opponent doesn't have many low provision cost units. But in that case, I think what you do is you pack your own deck with some 4 provision cost Death Wish units, so that in the worst case scenario, for the first round of this order ability, you consume one of your own units. And once that provision limit gets high enough, you should be able to consume at least something on your opponent's side. But in that case, Yaga is going to need to stay on the board for a long time, so I imagine most of the time, people may hide Yaga behind a Cave Troll. Otherwise, if you don't, and maybe you don't even have Sabbath, you'll play Yaga, it'll have 1 power, you won't be able to use its order yet, and your opponent can take it out with almost no effort. And that's not something you want to have happen to a 13 provision cost card. Now we have Northern Realms, and let's start with Alumni, which is a 4 power, 6 provision rare unit, and another card to add to the growing list of Northern Realms mages, and this is the Patience finisher that I was hoping that we would eventually get, because depending on which row you play it in, it will either damage your opponent or boost an allied unit equal to the highest amount of patience that you got with either your Banhard student or your Aretusa student. So if you had one of those students stick on the board for a long time and build up that patience, then the Alumni is a way to either get all of that damage or all that boosting without needing to wait. Especially if your highest patience Banhard student and Aretusa student both went over 4, because then you'll get Zeal. Then we have the Meditating Mage, which is a 4 power, 4 provision common unit, and this card surprised me a lot. It's another Patience Mage, and in this case, your Patience is powering up your Vitality, though I think that's going to be much tougher to use than the other Bronze Patience orders that we've seen in the past, because if you wait too long to use it, then you won't have enough time for all the Vitality to trigger. However, don't let that Patience ability distract you from what really makes this card special, because if you already have a Meditating Mage on the board and you play another one, then that second one will gain resilience, allowing it to stay on the board for the next round. And to be honest, I think that's kinda insane, because right now there are only 6 or 7 units that either have resilience or can give resilience to an allied unit with any sort of reliability. And of those cards, Vandergriff is the cheapest of the reliable sources of resilience at 8 provisions, and sure, he has 1 more power, he has a shield, and he's not exactly a meta card right now, but still, that's a 4 provision difference, and that's huge. So in this case, of all the bronze bonded units that we've seen in this expansion, I think the Meditating Mage has by far the most significant bonded ability. Then we have Rafford's Vengeance, which is a 5 power 9 provision epic unit, and this one is pretty crazy. Its order ability will play a bronze unit from our hand and then draw a card. Technically that means you are playing an additional card in that round, however when you consider that Rafford's Vengeance starts as a 5 power 9 provision unit, you would need to play an additional bronze unit to at least make this card potentially worth playing. Kind of similar to Furkart for Nilfgaard, except in this case you're playing a unit rather than a special card. Then with cooldown 5, if you play this early, then you could potentially use that ability several times in the same round, in which case it is definitely strong at that point. But in addition to that, if you have 2 soldiers or 2 mages next to this unit, then whenever you play a unit next to it, it will deal 2 damage to a random enemy unit. Now that means you need to continue to play new units next to it, and in order to still meet that crew condition, that means that all those units need to be either soldiers or mages. So that's not automatic, but there are so many Northern Realms mages now that should be pretty easy to do. Not to mention the card that immediately came to mind when I saw Rafford's Vengeance were the Sentry and Spellweavers. And the Spellweavers are mages, so you can play them next to Rafford's Vengeance, and they'll give you another source of damage. So between the Spellweavers and Rafford's Vengeance, your opponent may find it very difficult to shut down all of your damaging units. I think Sentry and Spellweavers already have a lot of great combos, so to add Rafford's Vengeance to that list means that I think we're going to see both of those cards, and all the other Northern Realms mages, a lot. Then, speaking of mages, the last Northern Realms card is Chapter of Wizards, which is a legendary 13 provision cost artifact, which has resilience, so it can stay on the board in between a round, and when you play it, it will spawn and play Rune Word, which is the Northern Realms special card that creates and plays a Northern Realms mage and gives it a shield, and I'm a big fan of Rune Word, so I think that's a good start. Then Chapter of Wizards also has an order ability to spawn a base copy of whatever the most recent bronze mage you played was in that row. So this gives a lot of mage synergies. So again, Sentry and Spellweavers come to mind as both cards you'd like to play with Rune Word, and cards that, if you already have them on the board, will get much stronger from Rune Word, and that makes Chapter of Wizards almost like a second Northern Realms scenario. Of course, scenarios usually do something on deploy and then have 2 additional rounds, if you meet their conditions, giving you a total of 3 cards built into that one scenario. However, in Chapter of Wizards' case, it's only 2 additional cards, but I'd argue that Rune Word and the additional Bronze Mage that you spawn could potentially be more powerful than the units that you would get from some scenarios because you could potentially get some strong engines. But unlike the scenarios, you don't need to meet any special conditions to use the order, and Chapter of Wizards also has resilience, so you could even save that order for the next round, whereas you can't do that for scenarios. Then lastly, we have neutrals, starting with Alyssa Henson, and when you play her, you'll shuffle a special card from your graveyard back into your deck. Notably, that can be either a bronze or a gold special card, so you should even be able to play some really big special cards, like Oneiromancy, Amphibious Assault, Blood Eagle, or Renew a second time. So that's one way to use Alyssa. However, if you do bring back a bronze special card, you will also create an additional copy of that to put back in your deck, and that option may be preferable for Scoia'tael if combined with Simlas. Then lastly, we have the 9 provision legendary artifact card, the Mushy Truffle, which is a location with resilience, and when you play it, it will spawn and play a bonded unit from your starting deck, and since we've seen a bunch more bonded units in this expansion, you'll have a lot more options. Then it also has an order to spawn and play Golden Froth, which is the special card that boosts 3 adjacent units by 2. So assuming you have at least 3 adjacent units out there when you use that order, you'll get 6 points from Golden Froth, and given how we were saying that most of the bonded units, when their bonded ability is active, are worth 8 points, that means the combination of those 2 components should give you about 14 points at a minimum. And that's already solid value, but if you have any other ways of having those bonded units synergize with your other cards, then the Mushy Truffle could be a very, very good card. In particular, I'm actually eyeing an older bonded unit, Skelga's Crow Clan Preacher, because if you can keep them on the board, they can become powerful engines, especially because Golden Froth is an alchemy card, so that gives you an easy way to get them boosted. So there's a look at all of the new cards from the Harvest of Sorrow expansion, the last component of the Price of Power set. Let me know in the comments what you think about the new cards, and if there are any particular combos that you think would be especially good. Of course, I didn't have time to mention every possible combination, and I'm sure there are some combos that I haven't even thought of. But that's always my favorite part of expansions, is finding new and exciting ways to use the new cards. If you're as excited as I am about the new expansion and the new Price of Power kegs, then tune in to twitch.tv/lidsvids at 10 p.m. GMT today to watch me open over 1,000 kegs. If you liked the video, then make sure to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of our other Gwent videos. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.